Now, there is another way to create an object using a constructor function. So let's delete circle.draw and define a constructor function. I want you to see them side by side. So once again, we define a function, but the naming convention we use for a constructor function is different. The first letter should be uppercase. So we call it circle with an uppercase C. To developers with background in languages like C# and Java, this kind of looks like a class. However, as you can see, we're defining a function. In JavaScript, we don't have the concept of classes. So our circle function is going to take a radius parameter, but in the body, instead of returning an object, we're going to use the this keyword to set the properties of this object. What is this? This is basically a reference to the object that is executing this piece of code. You're going to see that in a second. So imagine we have a new empty object in memory. Now we're going to use this to reference that object and then use dot notation to set various properties on that object. So we can set the radius property to this radius argument. Similarly, we can define another property, draw, but this is more accurately a method. So we set it to a function. And here we do a console.log of draw. Okay. Now we can create a new circle like this. We use the new operator to call the circle function and pass 1 as the argument. When we use the new operator, a few things happen under the hood. This new operator will create an empty object. So like this, an empty object. Then it will set this to point to that object, because by default, this points to the global object. If you're running this code inside of a browser, the global object is the window object. If you're running it inside a node environment, the global object is global. Let me show you. So I'm going to do a console.log of this. Let's see what happens. So save the changes. Now look, this is this circle object here. And here we have two members, draw and radius. This is because we used the new operator here. If I remove that, let's see what happens. So save the changes. Now this references the window object. So this is the global object in the browser. We don't want to use this. We don't want to mess up with this. We don't want to define global variables because they're bad practice, because they're available everywhere in our application. So it is possible that one function or another will modify the value of these variables accidentally and create a bug in our application. So when we use the new operator to call a function, three things happen. First, this new operator will create an empty object. Then it will set this to point to that object. And finally, it will return that object from this function. So note that here, we don't have an explicit return statement. We are not returning this. This will happen automatically when we use the new operator. So let me delete this. Also, we don't need console.log here. So basically, we have two ways to create an object. We can use a factory function or a constructor. There is nothing special about these. They're both regular functions in JavaScript. If we return an object in this function, we refer to that function as a factory function. In contrast, if we use the this keyword along with the new operator, we refer to that function as a constructor function. Now you might ask, what is the difference between these two patterns for creating an object? Which approach should you use? Well, it really depends who you ask. Developers coming from languages like C# and Java prefer the constructor function syntax because this looks like creating an instance of a class. But once again, in JavaScript, we don't really have classes. Other developers don't like this approach. They prefer to use factory functions. And one of their arguments is, what if a developer forgets to use the new operator here? Then we're defining these property methods on the global object, which is in this case the window object. But this discussion, this argument is really outdated. With the modern JavaScript and the tools that are available to us, we get an error if we forget to use the new operator here. So my suggestion to you is not to get hung up on these religious arguments about factories versus constructors. As a developer, you should be familiar with both these patterns because as you work on different projects and different teams, you will see both of these patterns for creating an object. So you should understand how they work. Choose the pattern that you prefer.